When Pam Bondi took a jab at Jasmine Crockett's education, most of the room laughed, but one student didn't. And what she said next brought the entire panel to a halt. It was a Thursday afternoon in Austin, Texas. A packed auditorium at the University of Texas buzzed with energy. A couple hundred people filled the room, students, professors, journalists, and a handful of curious locals who'd heard something controversial was brewing on campus. The event was titled Public Voices, Politics, Media, and the Power of Narrative. The flyer featured 4 headshots. One stood out. Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General. A name that provoked admiration or side eyes, depending on who, you asked. Inside, the air felt charged, not hostile. Not yet. But sharp. People weren't just listening. They were watching, reading the room, waiting. Some came for the spectacle, others for class credit. And then there was the young woman in the back row, who wasn't entirely sure why she came. Only that she had to. At the podium stood Professor Eleanor Wexler, the moderator. Calm, polished, unshakable. The type who'd moderated enough panels to know when something was about to break loose. To Bondi's right sat Dr. Cecil Owens, a black professor from Georgetown, known for his piercing critiques of political spin and media bias. To her left, Lila Shu, a rising journalist from San Francisco with bylines in The Atlantic. And on the far end, a late addition, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Her appearance had stirred a quiet buzz. You could tell who supported who by the claps and by the silences. You could tell who was filming for social media by how they held their phones. Chest high, screen tilted just so, thumb hovering. The conversation shifted from media's role in elections to how politicians are judged by their schools, accents, and zip codes. This was Jasmine's home turf. Her voice carried the cadence of courtrooms and campaign rallies, not lecture, halls. She was direct, grounded, not performative. She didn't embellish. She didn't have to. Pam Bondi, on the other hand, filled space beyond her seat. Her smirks were precise, her interruptions surgical, and then came the pivot point. It was almost offhanded. Maybe she meant it to land quietly. Bondi, talking about public perceptions of elected officials, glanced at Jasmine and said, "Let's not pretend every representative came out of Yale or Stanford. Some got in through, let's just say, less rigorous paths." Laughter trickled in, a couple of chuckles, one loud laugh from the back. The line hung in the air. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't even blink. But the crowd shifted. The moderator cleared her throat. Dr. Owens narrowed his eyes. Lila stared at her notes. And in the back row, a student gripped the armrest of her chair just a little tighter. She hadn't planned to speak. Barely made it at all. She was behind, on sleep. Behind on a paper. Her roommate had convinced her to come. But something about Bondi's comment struck a nerve. Because when Bondi said less rigorous paths, it didn't feel like she was talking about Jasmine anymore. It felt like she was talking about her. Something stirred in that back row. And no one, not even Pam Bondi, knew what was coming. Bondi shifted, brushing an invisible speck from her sleeve like she owned the moment. She was no stranger to tension. She'd thrived on it in courtrooms, on cable news, on stages like this. Her eyes scanned the crowd, daring a challenge. A few more chuckles followed, but they sounded different this time. Thinner, the kind of laugh you give when you're unsure if you're supposed to. Jasmine sat still, upright, hands calmly folded. Her eyes didn't waver. She'd been here before. She'd been underestimated more times than she could count. And in the stillness that followed, the silence as the room waited to see if Jasmine would respond, something inside that space seemed to stop. I didn't go to Yale, Jasmine said evenly. But I graduated cum laude from Thurgood Marshall School of Law, and I've yet to meet a piece of legislation that needed a Harvard stamp to pass. The applause came in ripples, more relief than rally. She hadn't taken the bait. But she'd made her point. Still, the moment didn't dissolve the way some hoped it might. You could see it in the way heads turned, in the way whispers started. Something had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to matter. And in the back row, the student whose hand still clutched the chair, her name was Alina Garvey, couldn't stop thinking about what had just been said, and how it landed. Pam's remark didn't sound like politics. It sounded personal. Like it was aimed at people like her, students who hadn't come from prep schools or legacy families, who didn't have endowments behind their names. Alina had grown up in Lubbock. Her mom cleaned offices overnight. Her dad fixed cars through the winter with cracked hands. She'd clawed her way into UT. 3 jobs, financial aid deadlines, long bus rides that felt like they'd never end. She didn't see herself in Jasmine Crockett every day. But in that moment, she did. And what stuck with her wasn't just what Bondi said. It was how easily she said it. Like some degrees came with weight, and others came with an asterisk. Like effort only mattered if it arrived stamped in Ivy League gold. Professor Wexler, ever the moderator, tried to steer the room back on course. Let's move to our next question, she said, about how media framing can shape the legitimacy of policy debates. But the air had shifted. No one was really listening. Then Dr. Owens leaned forward. His voice was deliberate, edged with steel. It's always interesting, he said, how fast we dismiss lived experience when it comes from the wrong zip code or the wrong school. Some of the sharpest minds I know never set foot near an Ivy League. Pam Bondi offered a polite smile, but her eyes had narrowed. She didn't enjoy being challenged, especially not by someone who held the room's quiet respect. Lila Shue gave a small nod, silent, scribbling something in her notebook. A detail, a quote, a feeling. Maybe for a future article. Maybe just to hold on to. Then, from the back, "Excuse me?" A voice, soft but firm. Heads turned. Pam raised an eyebrow. Even the moderator paused mid-sentence. Alina stood, notebook in one hand, thumb tucked in the spine, like it was holding her together. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of being seen. I just wanted to say. She looked down, then back up, steadier now. For some of us, getting into college at all was the hardest part. We didn't have private tutors. We didn't have parents who went before us. So, when someone questions the legitimacy of where we studied, they're not just talking about credentials. They're talking about people, about families like mine. Her voice cracked, just barely, and the room went still. She wasn't attacking. She wasn't performing. She was telling the truth, and truth, spoken plainly and without defense, can stop even the most practiced speaker in their tracks. But this wasn't the end. It was the spark, because something in that room began to ripple, and it couldn't be undone. Alina hadn't come to speak. She wasn't that student. She was the note-taker, the observer, the one who turned things in early and kept her head down. But sitting in that auditorium, hearing Bondi dismiss someone's education with a smirk, it hit like a punch she'd taken before. Not just because it was rude, because it was familiar. The guidance counselor's tone, the way certain classmates reacted when she said she went to a public school. She hadn't prepared a speech. Her throat was dry, but she knew what it felt like, to shrink in rooms that made you feel small, just for existing in them. Now she was standing, and her voice, was the only one filling the space. You said something earlier about certain degrees not being as rigorous, she continued. But I don't think you understand what it takes for some of us just to get into a classroom. She didn't waver, even as every eye turned toward her. The moderator said nothing. Even Bondi stayed quiet. Helena looked at the notebook in her hand, then closed it. She didn't need it anymore. My mom didn't finish high school. She works nights. My dad doesn't speak much English, but he still makes sure I eat before class. I didn't grow up with test prep books or private tutors. I studied in laundromats, in back seats. I fought to be here. There were gasps, a few quiet hmms from the front rows. No applause, just silence. Thick, full, undeniable. Dr. Owens leaned back slowly, arms folded, watching her. Jasmine Crockett didn't move, but her expression shifted. She saw something in Helena. Maybe a younger version of herself. Helena turned her gaze to Bondi. Her voice was steady now. Unapologetic. When you make a joke about someone's school, you're not just talking about where they went. You're talking about how they got there. And for people like me, that journey isn't a line on a resume. It's survival. Pam Bondi blinked. Once, twice. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The room no longer felt sharp. It felt real, heavy with something honest. Professor Wexler looked like she might speak, then thought better of it. She let the moment breathe. Finally, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward and spoke, softly, measured but sure. Jasmine turned slightly. What's your name? Helena hesitated. Helena Garvey. Jasmine smiled. Thank you, Helena. Just 3 words. But the way she said them, like she meant them, felt like more. Acknowledgement. Validation. Someone near the middle whispered, Wow. A guy in a UT hoodie leaned forward, elbows on his knees. She really just said that. Nobody laughed. Pam shifted in her chair, cleared her throat. I wasn't trying to insult anyone's experience, she said, her tone clipped. I was making a point about public perception and... But Jasmine interrupted, not loud, just firm. Perception is shaped by people in power, Ms. Bondi. And when those people use their power to mock where someone comes from, they don't get to hide behind semantics. That was it. Helena sat back down slowly, her heart still pounding. She wasn't sure if what she'd done was brave or reckless. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened her notebook again, but the pen didn't move. For once, she wasn't there to take notes. The panel didn't bounce back. The rhythm was gone. Something had cracked. The moderator thanked the panelists for a lively exchange of ideas, but her voice had lost its polish. Dr. Owens added a few thoughtful words. Lila Shue read a quote about educational equity from a recent article. But it was clear. They were still thinking about Helena, because you can't unhear something that honest. What Helena didn't know, not yet, was that her words hadn't just struck a nerve. They had opened a door, and others were ready to walk through it. The room hadn't moved much. Some bodies shifted slightly, but most stayed still, arms crossed, eyes either fixed at the front or flicking toward the back row, toward her. Pam Bondi, ever controlled, kept her expression neutral, but in her eyes something flickered. Calculation. She wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by a college student, and especially not like this. No shouting, no dramatics, just the truth, handed to her like a mirror. She leaned toward the mic. Let me clarify. My comment wasn't directed at anyone personally. It was a general observation about how the media perceives politicians based on their educational background. Alina didn't react. She stared ahead, not planning to speak again. Unless she had to. But Jasmine moved in her seat, slow and deliberate, then turned toward Pam. "With all due respect," Jasmine said evenly, "you made it personal when you looked directly at me." Pam raised her brows. "I never said your name." "You didn't need to." Jasmine's smile was tight but unmistakable. The implication was clear to everyone in this room. The moderator jumped in quickly, a little too quickly. "Let's try to keep the conversation productive." But Jasmine wasn't done. Her voice stayed low, measured, almost gentle, which only made it hit harder. "There's a difference between critiquing a system and reinforcing it. You can talk about media bias without demeaning someone's path. You can challenge perception without feeding the very stereotypes that hold people back." Pam tried to wave it off. "We're all adults here. Let's not pretend none of us have taken shots." Jasmine's tone sharpened just slightly. "Taking shots is politics. Dismissing someone's education as less rigorous? That's a dog whistle. One too many of us have heard before." The audience shifted again. A few heads nodded. One woman near the front muttered, "She's right." Pam looked toward the moderator, clearly waiting for a lifeline. But none came. Wexler sat still, pen in hand, lips pressed. Then, unexpectedly, a student in the second row raised her hand. Professor Wexler blinked, surprised but nodded. "Go, ahead." The student stood. "Latina, early 20s, UT sweatshirt. Sorry, I know this isn't a Q&A," she said, "but I need to say something. When I heard what you said, Ms. Bondi, I thought about how many times I've had to explain to my uncle that starting at community college wasn't taking a shortcut. I worked nights, saved every penny, transferred here because I earned it, and when people act like that, education isn't good enough. It doesn't sound like a joke. It sounds like they're saying, I don't belong." Silence, then another student stood. This time, a white guy in jeans and boots. "I didn't grow up poor," he said. "I had help. But my roommate, he's from the valley, first in his family to finish high school. What y'all are talking about, this isn't just politics. It's about who gets to be respected." Now the shift was undeniable. It wasn't a panel anymore. It was a reckoning. Pam Bondi leaned back, lips pursed, saying nothing. Because in that moment there wasn't anything left to say. Arms folded, lips pressed, Pam Bondi's grip on the narrative was gone. And Alina, she just sat there, quiet again, watching. She hadn't meant to lead anything. She wasn't trying to start a movement, but the words had come anyway, and something bigger had followed. Jasmine looked out at the students who had spoken. "This is what real dialogue looks like," she said. "Honest, uncomfortable, necessary." Even Dr. Owens seemed moved. He tapped his mic. "Sometimes," he said, "the most important lesson you'll learn on a campus doesn't come from a textbook. It comes from the moment you realize your voice matters." But the moment wasn't over. Not yet. Because what had just happened didn't just need to be heard. It needed to be felt, to be processed. The auditorium was no longer just a space for discussion. It had shifted. Students weren't spectators anymore. They were participants, shaping the room, shaping the moment. You could see it in the posture of the crowd. No more slouching, no more scrolling through phones. Everyone was present. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Pam adjusted her mic, but didn't speak. Her mouth tightened as she glanced at her notes, searching for a foothold. But whatever speech she'd prepared no longer fit. The room didn't belong to the panelists anymore. It belonged to the students. Then someone else stood. Third row, older than most, maybe a grad student, maybe a TA. He cleared his throat. "My name is Jordan Ellis," he said. "I teach a freshman seminar on political identity, and I just want to say, when we turn these conversations into resume contests, we miss the point. Education isn't about where you learned. It's about what you do with what you've learned." He paused, then added, "And honestly, some of the people who look down on others' degrees, they couldn't survive a semester outside their comfort zone." That drew claps. Real ones this time. Not polite. Earned. Pam looked toward Professor Wexler, hoping for a way out. Wexler leaned into her mic. "Let's pause here," she said gently. "There's clearly something powerful happening in this room, and I think we owe it to the students to listen." In the back, Alina was still seated, still listening. Her hands had stopped trembling, notebook open, pen down, just watching, taking it in. Then Jasmine turned in her chair, not toward the crowd this time, but toward Alina. "You started something today," she said. "You reminded everyone what courage looks like." Alina gave a small nod, overwhelmed, unsure what to do with the attention. But Jasmine wasn't done. "I came here expecting debate," she said. "What I got instead was a reminder. Our voices don't just echo in rooms like this. They shape them, and sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one holding the mic. It's the one who stands up when it's hardest." Silence followed, but not the brittle kind. This quiet was full, sacred, the kind of silence that settles over something that matters. Then finally, Pam Bondi spoke. Her tone was steady, but the edge was gone. "I've been in public life a long time," she said. "I've handled criticism, pushed back on narratives I thought were unfair, but I'll admit, I didn't expect this. And maybe I needed to hear it." That surprised people. It wasn't an apology, not quite, but it was a crack in the armor, a rare moment of reflection from someone who rarely offered one. Dr. Owens picked up the thread. "This isn't about pointing fingers," he said. "It's about how we speak to, and about, each other. Who gets heard? That matters more than most people realize." He looked around the room. "Because if the people shaping the future don't feel like they belong at the table, we're in trouble." A long pause, then a slow ripple of applause. Not cued, not forced. It just happened. No chance, no signals. Just hands meeting in rhythm, one side of the room to the other. And for the first time since the panel began, Pam Bondi didn't interrupt. She just listened. Outside those walls, no one yet knew what had taken place. But what was coming next? It would ensure that this moment wouldn't stay confined to a lecture hall. When the applause faded, the weight of the moment didn't lift. It lingered. But not as tension, as truth. A girl in the second row leaned toward her friend and whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." Her friend nodded slowly, eyes still forward, lips tight, like if she spoke, she might cry. Professor Wexler closed her folder and set it gently on the table. She wasn't going to force the conversation back to the agenda. This mattered more. And somewhere in that stillness, it began to dawn on everyone. This moment wasn't really about Pam Bondi, or even Jasmine Crockett. Not entirely. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about something deeper, older, heavier. It was about how people get measured. By where they come from, how they speak, what their resume looks like, how close their names sit to power, and how, in that room, a surprising number of people suddenly recognized themselves in Alina's voice, even if they hadn't known her name before today. In the front row, a freshman named Colleen tugged on the sleeves of her hoodie and stood. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I'm from Roswell," she said, eyes scanning no one, and everyone. "I never thought I was smart enough for a place like this. People always talked over me. I failed my first exam here. I cried in a bathroom stall and almost dropped out." She paused, her breath. "But I didn't. And when someone made that comment earlier about less rigorous paths, I felt like I was right back in that stall, like I was already behind before I even opened my mouth." Another student stood behind her, then another. No one prompted them. They just rose. Temi Tope, a Nigerian-American engineering major, shared how his accent had been mocked during a group project. A girl from Amarillo talked about driving 90 miles just to reach a testing center for her SAT because her school couldn't afford to host one. These stories weren't about politics. They were about identity, about dignity, about belonging, and they'd all been buried under quiet until now. Pam Bondi stayed seated. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't speaking. She was just watching. For once, her presence wasn't the loudest in the room. Jasmine Crockett turned to Wexler, then back to the students. "This is why I ran for office," she said, voice low. "Not because I had all the answers, but because too many people who look like me are still being asked to prove they belong in rooms they've already earned their way into." It wasn't a stump speech, no slogans, just truth, stripped down and standing bare. Helena still hadn't spoken again. But now, people weren't just admiring her, they were recognizing her. A girl with curly hair and chipped nail polish slipped into the seat beside her and whispered, "You said what I've always wanted to say." Helena smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't come from pride, but from the quiet relief of not staying silent when it mattered most. Back on stage, Dr. Owen leaned forward. "We all like to believe merit is enough," he said softly. "But merit isn't handed out evenly. Some of us walk into rooms with doors already open. Others spend years just trying to find one that isn't locked. No one clapped. No one cheered. They just listened, soaking it in, processing. And that was the most powerful part, because this wasn't a viral moment, not yet. No one outside the auditorium was tweeting. CNN wasn't there. No hashtags had been born. But for everyone inside, it was unforgettable. Still, one more thing needed to be said. Not by a panelist, not by a student, but by someone who'd been quietly watching from the sidelines all along. Leaning against the side wall near the exit was a tall man in a dark blazer, a university badge clipped to his belt, unmoving through most of the event, quiet, observant. But his eyes had missed nothing. Professor Eli Traynor, Dean of Political Science, former journalist, not flashy, not loud, the kind of man whose silence had weight. And now he stepped forward, just as the room balanced on that thin edge between catharsis and closure. No mic, no notes. "Mind if I say something?" he asked. Heads turned. Even Pam looked up, surprised. Jasmine gave a small nod. He walked toward the front. "I wasn't on the panel," he said. "Didn't come to speak. I just came to listen. But it's clear something real happened in this room today, and we should acknowledge that before we pretend. To go back to business." His gaze swept the crowd. Calm, direct, students, faculty, guests. We came expecting a discussion about politics and media. What we got was something harder, something better. We got truth, raw, uncomfortable, beautiful, He turned toward Alina. Miss Garvey, you didn't just speak. You reminded us, especially those of us buried in meetings and conference calls, why we're even here in the first place. Education isn't about pedigree. It's about people. And courage. Like yours? That's the foundation of change. Alina blinked, overwhelmed. She didn't know what to say. A few students clapped quietly. Others wiped their eyes. Then Dean Traynor faced the room again. I spent years in media and politics, he said, and the most powerful voices I ever heard didn't come from campaign stages or studio lights. He paused and let the silence speak for itself. They came from the back rows, Dean Traynor said, from people who weren't supposed to say anything, from the ones everyone overlooks. He paused, letting it land. So maybe today, instead of pretending this didn't happen, we carry it forward, into the next class, the next conversation, into how we treat people, especially the ones who didn't grow up with the world holding the door open for them. The room was silent, still, every ear tuned in. Because this wasn't just about one offhand comment or one bold response. It was about who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, who gets to feel human in spaces designed to make them feel small. It hit harder than anyone expected. Even the AV tech at the side stopped fiddling with cables and looked up. Dean Traynor gave a small nod, then stepped back, hands behind his back, silence stretched. Not awkward, not empty. The kind of silence that follows something sacred. Pam Bondi sat still, hands clasped. There was no rebuttal, no polished soundbite that could undo what had just unfolded. Then from the second row, Lila, quiet until now, notepad full, finally raised her voice. I'll be writing about today, she said, but not like a journalist chasing a headline. I'll be writing it down because stories like this don't happen in lecture halls every day, and they deserve to be remembered the right way. She turned toward Elena. You reminded us that courage doesn't always need a podium. Sometimes it just needs a reason. Jasmine Crockett nodded slowly. And today gave us one. Around the room, conversations sparked again. Not debates, not arguments, but real connections. Students turning to each other, sharing names, swapping stories, making plans to meet for coffee and keep talking. No one reached for their phones. No one rushed out. It wasn't about going viral. It was something deeper. And yet, as the panel drew to a close and students slowly began gathering their things, one last moment would seal the day. The auditorium emptied slowly, like people were, walking through water, backpacks slung, jackets folded, voices lowered, like leaving a funeral rather than a panel. Elena stayed seated. She wasn't waiting for applause. There wasn't any. Not the kind you hear at movie endings. Just something quieter, heavier, like everyone in that room knew they'd witnessed something important and were still figuring out how to carry it. Jasmine Crockett approached her first. No cameras, no drama, just the sound of her heels clicking gently on the tile. Hey, she said softly. Elena looked up, unsure whether to stand. She started to, but Jasmine waved her off, kneeling slightly to meet her eye to eye. I meant what I said earlier, Jasmine told her. You reminded me why I ran. You didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for hundreds of students who've been told their stories aren't enough. Elena nodded, eyes wet. I wasn't trying to be brave, she said. I just couldn't. Stay quiet. Brave isn't about wanting to speak, Jasmine said gently. It's about choosing to, especially when it costs you something. They shook hands. It wasn't performative. It was respect, quiet and real. As Jasmine stood and headed toward the side exit, she passed Pam Bondi. The two exchanged a glance, not hostile, not warm, neutral. But it was clear. The power in the room had shifted, and they both knew it. Dean, Trainer, still standing off to the side, caught Eleanor's eye. He gave a small nod, the kind that said, "Well done," without saying anything at all. Outside, the late afternoon light had begun to fade. A few students lingered in clusters near the courtyard, still buzzing from what had just happened. Some swapped Instagram handles. Others just stood together saying nothing. Helena stepped out with her notebook hugged to her chest like armor. On the sidewalk, a classmate jogged to catch up. "Hey, I'm Malik." "Well, Melvin, actually." He stumbled. "I just wanted to say what you did in there. That took guts." She gave a faint smile. "Thanks." "I froze," he admitted. "I wanted to speak too. I just couldn't." "It's okay," Elena said. "You don't always have to speak. Sometimes it's enough just to feel it." They walked together for a few steps, 20 feet maybe. Then he veered toward the library, and she kept going toward the dorms. On her way, she passed the same hallway where she'd sat for freshman orientation. Back row, head down, too nervous to say her name out loud. But today, she had stood. She had spoken. She had shifted a room, and something inside her had shifted too. At her dorm, she paused at the door, hand on her keycard. Her phone buzzed. A text lit the screen. Her roommate had texted, "Are you okay? You're all over the campus group chat." "Aaron." Helena didn't respond right away. Inside her dorm, everything looked the same. A pile of books on her desk, homework to finish, a midterm coming up, life on the surface, unchanged. But nothing about tonight felt normal. She sat down, opened her notebook, and flipped past pages filled with class notes, deadlines, timelines. Then she started a new page. At the top, she wrote, "Use your voice, even if it shakes." Underneath, "Because someone in the room needs to hear you do it first." Before this story fades into another ordinary school day, one last truth needs to be told. Courage doesn't just shift a moment. It reshapes what people believe is possible. The next morning, the campus looked the same, but not to the people who'd been in that room. Sidewalks buzzed with quiet conversations that had nothing to do with midterms or dining hall hours. People were still talking. About her. The girl from the back row who stood up and said what half the room didn't know they needed to hear. There were no trending hashtags, no headlines, just murmurs in hallways, screenshots in group chats, and late-night texts. One message made the rounds. A quote from Jasmine Crockett. "Sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one with the microphone. It's the one who stands up when it's hardest." It didn't feel like a quote to repost. It felt like a question. What would I have done in that room? Later that day, Professor Wexler sent an email to everyone who'd attended. She ended it with a line that wasn't from any university template. "Some lessons live outside the syllabus. Yesterday was one of them." And at the very bottom, tucked quietly in the last line, "To the student who spoke from the back, thank you." Eleanor read it while sitting on the steps of the philosophy building. She didn't know how to reply, or if she even should. Her phone had messages from professors, classmates, even an old TA from freshman year. Most of them said the same thing, in different ways. "You made us think." But she didn't feel brave. She felt exposed, like she'd said something too loud in a too quiet room, and now couldn't take it back. But slowly, hour by hour, it settled differently in her chest. Not as a burden, but as a kind of gravity, a reminder that words matter most when they come from where it hurts. Later that week, she passed by Dr. Owen's office and saw his door open. She hadn't planned to stop. She just did. He looked up from his laptop. "Ah, Miss Garvey. I just wanted to say thanks," she said from the doorway. He gestured toward the chair. "No thanks needed. You reminded the rest of us what classrooms are supposed to be about." She sat. "I didn't think anyone would listen." "Oh, we listened," he said, folding his hands. "We didn't move. That's how you know." Then, after a pause, he asked, "Do you want to work on something? Like an assignment?" He shook his head. "No. Something bigger. An idea. A piece. A question worth building a conversation around." Elena hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm the right person." He gave her a small, knowing smile. "You already proved you are." She left his office with a notebook half-filled and a mind buzzing with possibilities. Across campus, Jasmine Crockett had stayed after the event. She met quietly with a few faculty members, spoke with a student advocacy group, listened more than she talked. Before she left, she turned to Professor Wexler. "Keep me posted about Elena," she said. "She's going to be something. Might already be." And Pam Bondi. She flew out the next morning. No press release, no follow-up tweet. Just left. As if she understood nothing she said could compete with what had already been felt. Because the real moment, the one no camera caught, wasn't the comment, or even the comeback. It was a choice, a student deciding to stand, to speak, to shake the air in a room full of power, with nothing but truth. That's what stayed. That's what mattered. And long after the chairs were folded and the microphones packed away, the echo of that voice, small, trembling, real, was still teaching people what leadership actually looks like. Because in a world full of headlines and sound bites, sometimes the story that changes people most never goes viral. It just gets remembered. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you feel, or think, or remember, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more true, human stories about what becomes possible when one voice dares to rise above the noise.